All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into this story in the Bible about Moses and why he wasn't allowed to enter the promised land. I mean, after he led the Israelites out of Egypt, you'd think that'd be like the reward, right?
Right.
But, we're going to look at this YouTube video from Untold Bible Stories. And it's interesting because they focus on like the literal interpretation of the Bible, but there's tons of metaphorical interpretations out there too. So, that's something to keep in mind.
Yes, definitely.
So, I guess to start this off, it's kind of interesting how like the story really starts to get going once they get to the desert of Zin, which is right on the edge of the promised land. Yeah. And it's there that things get kind of crazy.
Yeah, things take a turn for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because in the video, it actually like quotes the Israelites complaining and are like, why have you brought us out into this desolate wilderness with no water to drink? Like, talk about being thirsty.
Right.
And ungrateful.
Definitely a pattern throughout their journey.
Yeah.
They see plagues, parting of the Red Sea, and still they doubt God and Moses.
Yeah. It's like they constantly need to be reassured.
It seems like it, yeah.
So what happens when their doubts kind of reach a boiling point? Especially in this desert where there's no water.
Well, that's when they find themselves in a pretty dire situation.
Mm-hmm.
And God instructs Moses to speak to a rock. And water will come out. It seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But this is where things really kind of get interesting.
Yeah. So why doesn't Moses just like follow God's instructions? Because the video makes it sound like he was just like at his wit's end.
Yeah, I think it's been decades of dealing with the Israelites complaining.
Right.
And it all just kind of boils over. And he ends up striking the rock, not once, but twice.
And that's where it all goes wrong. I mean, in the video, God even says to Moses, like, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. That's rough.
It's pretty intense.
Talk about consequences.
Yeah. And, it's such a pivotal moment in the story. It makes us think about, like, what it means to be a leader.
Right.
Like, you have this massive figure, Moses.
Yeah.
And he makes this seemingly small mistake. And it has these giant consequences. It makes you wonder, like, how do our actions, even when we're frustrated, reflect our faith and our leadership?
So clearly there's something more going on here than just Moses hitting a rock. The video keeps kind of hinting at this, like, deeper meaning. Something about Jesus.
Yeah.
What's the deal with that?
The video points out that the rock itself wasn't just like some random rock. It was foreshadowing Jesus Christ.
Okay, wait. So foreshadowing, what does that even mean, like in this context?
Well, foreshadowing is when like a character or an event hints at something that's going to happen later.
Right.
And in this case, the rock Moses struck is a prefiguration of Jesus.
Okay, but like how did they come up with that? Like did somebody just decide like, oh yeah, the rock's totally Jesus?
No. The Apostle Paul in Corinthians, he says, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's pretty direct. But, like, how does hitting a rock connect to Jesus? It just seems so literal.
Well, you got to think about it metaphorically. So Jesus was crucified once to offer redemption. By striking the rock twice, Moses basically symbolically crucified Christ repeatedly.
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense now. So, but why is that such a big deal?
Well, because it shows a lack of faith in God's plan. Moses, in his anger and frustration, he acted on his own instead of trusting that God would provide.
Yeah.
And it was basically like rejecting the sacrifice that Jesus would eventually make.
So it's not just about disobedience then, it's about the implications of that disobedience.
Right. And that brings us to a really crucial point. Like some actions, even seemingly small ones, can have some pretty big consequences, especially when it comes to faith.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, like, how do we make sure that our actions, even in moments of weakness, are aligned with our faith?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. So we got this really powerful story about disobedience and symbolism and the weight of leadership. But I think what's really interesting is that the video mentions that Moses continued his relationship with God despite this huge mistake. How's that even possible?
Well, that's where the idea of grace comes in, and that's something we're going to explore a lot more in part 2.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
See you then.
See you then.
Okay, so we were talking about how Moses was still able to like have this relationship with God even after, he wasn't allowed into the promised land. It's just hard to imagine going through something like that and not just feeling totally crushed.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to God's grace and forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
The video really emphasizes that even though Moses messed up, God still provided for the Israelites. They still got the water that they needed.
Yeah, it's like God was saying, okay, you made a mistake, but like I'm still going to take care of my people It shows that God's grace is bigger than our mistakes.
Yeah, definitely.
And what's interesting is that this story doesn't portray Moses like as this perfect hero. You know, he gets frustrated, he loses his temper,
Right.
He makes a mistake.
He's human.
He's human, and God still uses him.
Exactly.
That's actually pretty encouraging, you know?
Yeah.
It means, like, we don't have to be perfect to be used by God. Like, our flaws don't disqualify us.
Right. Our struggles can actually bring us closer to God. Yeah. It's usually in those moments of weakness that we realize we need him.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I still wonder, like, what must have been going through Moses' head, knowing he couldn't enter the promised land? I mean, that must have been so hard to deal with.
Yeah, the video doesn't really go into Moses' thoughts. But we can imagine how disappointed he must have felt. I mean, imagine dedicating your life to leading people to freedom and then being told you can't experience it with them.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. But the video makes it clear that Moses didn't, like, turn away from God. He still kept that relationship going.
He did. And it says a lot about his faith. Like, he could have gotten bitter and resentful. But instead, he chose to trust God, even when he was disappointed.
So it seems like true faith isn't about, like, never struggling or never messing up. It's about continuing to believe even when things are hard.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's a message that a lot of people can relate to. You know, we all face setbacks. We all make mistakes. And we all have those times where we question our faith.
So, like, how do we apply this lesson to our own lives? How do we keep going when we have those Moses moments? You know, those times where we feel like we've totally blown it?
Well, the video doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide.
Yeah.
But I think we can learn a lot from Moses' experience.
Okay, so what can we learn?
Well, first, I think we need to acknowledge our mistakes. You know, Moses didn't try to blame anyone else. He owned up to what he did.
That takes a lot of humility to admit that we're not perfect.
It does. And second, we need to seek forgiveness and reconciliation. You know, even though Moses faced consequences, his relationship with God wasn't over. He kept seeking God's guidance.
So even when we make mistakes, we can always come back to God.
Always. There's no mistake too big for God's forgiveness.
That's good to know.
Yeah. And finally, I think we need to learn from our mistakes.
Right.
And let them shape us. You know, Moses' experience, even though it was painful, it helped him understand God's character better and his own need to rely on God.
So our failures can actually help us grow.
Exactly. And in a way, that's the most hopeful part of this story. Even when we mess up, even when we face consequences, God's grace and love are still there.
That's a really nice thought. But there's still something that's been bugging me this whole time.
Oh, yeah? What's that?
Well, we talked about the rock as, like, foreshadowing Jesus. But what about the water? It seems like water is a really big part of this story.
You're right. The video doesn't really talk about this. But the symbolism of water goes way beyond just physical thirst. In the Bible, water is associated with life-cleansing spiritual renewal.
Oh, okay. So how does that connect to the story of Moses and the rock?
That's a great question. And a perfect way to lead into part 3 of our deep dive. We'll explore the deeper meaning of this story, especially the symbolism of water and how it connects to grace, redemption, and spiritual thirst.
So we were talking about water being, like, more than just water, right? The video kind of hinted at something deeper but didn't really go into detail.
Yeah.
So what's the deal with that?
Well, throughout the Bible, water consistently symbolizes spiritual renewal and cleansing. Like, it represents life itself.
Okay.
In the Old Testament especially, there's tons of instances where water is like a source of divine provision and blessing.
So, like, when God parted the Red Sea for the Israelites?
Exactly. It represents a new beginning, you know, a liberation from slavery and oppression. And remember, this story is set in the desert.
Right, where water is, like, super scarce.
Exactly. And so it makes it even more symbolic.
So then the rock that provides the water is more than just a rock.
Right.
It's not just about being thirsty.
It's about God's provision.
Yeah.
His life-giving power. And ultimately like a prefiguration of Christ. Remember that verse from Corinthians, that rock was Christ.
Yeah.
Makes you think, right?
Yeah, so by Moses hitting the rock, he wasn't just disobeying God, he was rejecting the spiritual life that Jesus would offer.
It's a pretty powerful way to think about it. And it shows how the Old and New Testaments are connected. The story of Moses and the rock foreshadows Jesus,
right,
who's described as the living water that quenches our spiritual thirst.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. But it makes sense. We all have this, like, inner thirst for something more, a longing for meaning and purpose.
Right.
And it's Jesus who satisfies that.
It's a beautiful parallel. And, you know, it reminds us that the stories in the Bible aren't just history. They contain these timeless truths that we can apply to our lives today.
Yeah. This deep dive has definitely made me rethink how I see this story. It's crazy how like a simple story can be so deep.
It really shows how rich and complex the Bible is. There's always something new to discover.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly.
The more you explore, the more you realize there's more to learn.
It's a lifelong journey.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are you thirsting for? What areas of your life need that spiritual refreshment? And how can this story point you towards the living water found in Christ?
It's definitely a question worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into why Moses didn't enter the Promised Land.
See ya.